Hi there, I'm here to explain the modes. Many of you are asked to write and identify modes in your theory work, and I thought that I would explain it to you the way that I find students understand modes best. So the things that you are already familiar with are you're familiar with how to write. I'm assuming that you're familiar with how to write major scales. So a major scale, let's take for example the C major scale, goes from C to C. I can also write the C major scale so that it starts on the supertonic, which is the second scale step, and play the scale or write the scale from D to D. Okay, I can write the scale so that it goes from E to E, the mediant to the mediant, or the subdominant to the subdominant, or the dominant to the dominant. I'm going to go down here for that. Or the submediant to the submediant, or the leading note to the leading note. Okay, so some of those are going to sound familiar. A couple of them, in fact, so from C to C is the major scale. And from A to A is the natural minor scale. Those are probably scales that you're familiar with, especially the major scale, because it's quite common. So most of the time you're asked to write scales that begin with the tonic. That's the first scale step. And you go from tonic to tonic. But when we're writing modes, it's good to kind of wrap your brain around thinking of going to different scale steps. So I'm going to write a mode, the Dorian mode actually, which goes from the supertonic to the supertonic. And the Phrygian mode goes from the mediant to the mediant, all on the white keys of the piano. Lydian goes from the subdominant to the subdominant. I'm going to go fifth down now. A fourth down to the dominant, which is the fifth scale step. That's the Mixolydian mode. The Aeolian mode, otherwise known as the natural minor scale, is like going from the submediant to the submediant. And Locrian is like going from the leading note to the leading note. It's not a very common mode that we use. Okay, so the first way that I like to think about doing this is I like to think about if they, for example, ask you to write the Dorian mode starting on E. Now I'm going to remember that the Dorian mode is like going from the supertonic to the supertonic. And so I ask myself, what scale is E the supertonic of? What major scale is E the supertonic of? And E is the supertonic of the major scale that begins on D. Okay, so when I play the Dorian mode starting on E, it's like going from the supertonic to the supertonic in the key of D, which means I'm going to use F sharp and C sharp to play Dorian mode starting on E. This would be E Dorian. Okay, so that is one way to think about them. Let's just take that another example. So that would be E Dorian going from E to E. Let's try to play Mixolydian, which is like going from the dominant to dominant, but let's play it in the key of C. So to do that, I'm going to ask myself, what scale is C the dominant of? Because I know that Mixolydian is like going from the dominant to the dominant. So C is the dominant note of the scale of F. Okay, F major. So F major has a B flat, And I'm going to remember when I play the C Mixolydian mode that I need to also include that B flat. So that's probably the easiest way to figure out what the mode is that you're asked to identify. Okay, well, this is like going from the supertonic to the supertonic in the key of D major because it has an F sharp and a C sharp. So that means because it goes from scale step 2 to scale step 2 that it's Dorian mode. If I'm asked to write the Mixolydian mode that starts on C and ends on C, I'm going to think to myself, C is the dominant key of F. That means I'm going to need to include the key signature that I would find in the scale of F major, which would be the B flat. And when I go from C to C, I'm going to include a B flat, and that's going to give me the Mixolydian mode. Okay, so thinking about the other ways to think about these scales. Well, these modal scales. So one thing that they teach you early on is that major scales and minor scales have different combinations of tones and semitones. So a major scale, tones and semitones are also whole steps and half steps. I just use tones and semitones. It's kind of faster to say. Tones and semitones, starting with C. So I start with the home note, and the next one is tone up, semitone up, another tone, semitone. So tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. When you have modal scales, so for example, the Dorian mode that starts on D, those tones and semitones get mixed up. So I'm going to start on D, then you go up a tone, there's going to be a semitone, and then there's going to be a tone, semitone, and a tone at the top. So the tones and semitones get mixed up into different places. Some people like to use that method as well to figure out what modes they are identifying, or to write modes. I find that it's a little bit clunkier than thinking about, oh, well, this is just like writing a scale that goes from the dominant to the dominant, for example, or the leading note to the leading note. So I don't find that it's the most efficient way, but if it's something that works for you, go for it. Okay, so the last way that I hear modes taught goes like this. Yeah, and this works mostly for identifying scales by ear, I find, for students. So if you hear a piece in a certain mode, or you hear a certain mode being played, you can identify it this way. So the C major scale sounds like this. And a couple of the modes sound really, really, really similar. So Lydian sounds pretty similar. It's just that B flat that you would usually have with the F major scale is going to be raised. So instead of having this as the first 5 notes of your scale, which you would have with F major, the 4th scale step is raised. And that's what gives the Lydian scale a different sound than the major scale. Mixolydian, also really similar. Here's G major. Sounds a whole lot like G Mixolydian, sounds a whole lot like G major, except when you get to the top, instead of having that F sharp, the 7th is dropped. So that's another way to identify modes. How are they similar to major scales? A few of the modes also sound like minor scales. Dorian sounds a whole lot like D natural minor, except the 6th is raised. Here's D natural minor. Here's Dorian D. Or D Dorian, as most people would call it. So it sounds a whole lot like natural minor. The Dorian scale does. Of course, the Aeolian scale, going from the submediant to the submediant, is the natural minor scale that many of you will be familiar with if you're studying music theory. And the other two that kind of sound minor, one more so than the other, is the Phrygian mode, which goes from the mediant to the mediant, if we're talking about the first way of figuring out modes. So here's what the natural minor scale sounds like beginning on E. But the Phrygian mode sounds like this. It's got a lowered second, so has a unique sound. So it's just like the natural minor scale, except that that second is lowered, meaning it sounds a semitone lower than it would in the natural minor scale. So the other one that is not so commonly used is the Locrian scale, and the Locrian mode, and the Locrian mode is a little bit like natural minor, but not as much as Dorian, because not only does it lower the second, but it also lowers the fifth. So let's play B natural minor first. And now here's B Locrian, and you'll notice that the second is dropped and the fifth is dropped. So not entirely a common sounding scale. And if you find that you have a scale with a dropped second like that, it's probably either Phrygian or Locrian. I hope that helps you with your modes. If you have any questions, you can put them in the YouTube thread, or you can ask me through email. I'm musiclessonsbythepark@gmail.com. And I'm here to help you with your theory, whether it's figuring out modes, learning how to write modes, learning a bit about modes, or if you have any other theory questions, happy to help as well. Okay,